An Air New Zealand Route Clearance Unit, or an RCU, had been established under the control of the Flight Operations Division, the supervisor of which was tasked with responsibility for the briefing of air crews by means of audio-visual material and, where necessary, supplementary simulator exercises. Broadly speaking, the content of the audio-visual briefing packages described the main features of the flight by way of a tape recording specifically prepared for the purpose. At suitable intervals during the oral presentation, slides would be shown on a screen, depicting a photographic representation of the subject matter under discussion. At the conclusion of the presentation, the on-site supervisory officer was available to elaborate on any of the prepared material if necessary. Copies of the prepared text would be distributed to the crew members present for their own personal retention and further study. There was no official supervisor of the Routes Clearance Unit until the 1st of April 1977, when the position was given to one Captain Lawson. He supervised the RCU on a part-time basis until the 1st of January 1978, when Captain Wilson was appointed the full-time Route Clearance Unit supervisor. When it was decided to start operating Antarctic flights, Captain Lawson was directed by the chief pilot to travel on the first flight for RCU purposes. He therefore travelled on the first flight as co-pilot. After the first 2 Antarctic flights in 1977, he began assembling an RCU Antarctic brief pack. He obtained various photographs of Antarctica from the publicity section of the airline and eventually selected certain slides thought suitable to depict the general topography of the area. Captain Lawson also prepared written material which was subsequently recorded and used in conjunction with the display of the slides. Of note, although Lawson had flown to and seen for himself the conditions relevant to these Antarctic flights, Wilson, his successor, had not. As already stated, the audio-visual presentation is normally aimed at a specific airfield with particular reference to approach procedures, runways, navigation aids and the like. However, in the case of the Antarctic program, no landing was intended, and accordingly attention was paid during the presentation to matters such as the minimum safe altitude in flight, the details of the 6,000-foot letdown procedure, and most importantly, the topic of polar grid navigation. This reference to grid navigation requires some explanation. At the point where the meridians of longitude reach the pole, they are, of course, all joined together, and the distance between each has been progressively narrowing. If an aircraft is approaching the South Pole, it will be travelling south, but the moment it overflies the pole, it will then be travelling north. The grid system of navigation is designed to get over the unsatisfactory communication consequences of an aircraft theoretically changing its heading by 180 degrees while still flying on a straight line course. Grid headings supplant true headings in all areas south of 60 degrees latitude by providing only one north and south direction, which will apply over the whole of the polar area. The substitution of grid headings for true headings, therefore, has the effect that an aircraft on a heading of true south as it approaches Antarctica will have a grid heading of true north. In order to ascertain a grid heading, the crew adopts a meridian of east longitude and adds hitherto 180 degrees. The result, therefore, is that if an aircraft is flying on a heading parallel with the 166 degrees east longitude, then its true heading will be 166, but its grid heading will be 346, exactly 166 plus the reciprocal of 180 degrees. All McMurdo radio transmissions referring to aircraft headings are supplied in grid form. Therefore, one of the main purposes of the RCU Antarctic briefing was to demonstrate, both by speech, slide and simulator exercise, the method of adjusting the aircraft's compasses to grid polar navigation. The RCU briefing given to Antarctic crews was quite clearly accurate in respect of these technical requirements. But it was the opinion of the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale, when he examined all the RCU briefing material, that it contained some significant deficiencies. The deficiencies or omissions specifically highlighted by Chippendale related to, amongst others, the fact that Air New Zealand failed to highlight the fact that their intended route overhead McMurdo differed from the normal military route, that topographical charts were not provided for the flight, that a comprehensive briefing of the visual phenomenon peculiar to the Antarctic, that being the potential for whiteout, and the conditions which might give rise to such conditions was never undertaken. And finally, that a discussion surrounding the procedure for attempting a landing on the local ice runway and the emergency conditions which might necessitate such a landing was never had. At Collins' briefing, 2 charts were produced, in addition to a slide which depicted the track south to be down McMurdo Sound. This was in conflict with a reference in the recorded text of the briefing, which indicated the actual latitude and longitude of McMurdo Station as being the final destination waypoint, and as such a significant inconsistency went unnoticed. Furthermore, and what was also described as an omission, was the fact that the briefing pack contained no photographs depicting the view of McMurdo Sound and Ross Island as the aircraft approached from the north. This is of particular significance in view of the fact that the McMurdo area bears little relationship to what might be expected from a topographical map of the area. Also, Chippendale's initial report was critical of the fact that the briefing content did not include a topographical map of the immediate area upon which the flight plan track from Cape Hallett to McMurdo had been superimposed. Had it, the crew would have had a clear indication of the intended track south and the proximity of this track to the significant terrain of Ross Island. In relation to the slides which were shown to the crew, 2 significant mistakes were noted. One slide purported to show Cape Hallett, whereas in fact it actually showed Cape Adair, located some 73 miles further to the northwest. The second slide showed a view of Mt.Erebus and was accompanied by a statement that the aircraft was now approaching Erebus at 16,000 feet, the minimum sector altitude. However, the photograph depicted had been taken from due south of the mountain, with the aircraft on a northerly heading. As a result, which was significant, it thus displayed Erebus to the left of the aircraft's track. Therefore, with the statement made that the aircraft was approaching Erebus and the mountain depicted to the obvious left of track, the reinforced visual message to the crew was that the southerly track would be down the flat expanse of the Sound, with the elevated terrain of Ross Island to pass down their left-hand side. In relation to the said 16,000 foot minimum sector altitude, despite the text of the route briefing indicating such, by his own admission, this fact was verbally contradicted by Captain Wilson in preparation for the flights conducted during 1978 and 1979. His comments at the time indicated to crews that they were, in fact, permitted to descend to any altitude approved by the US Navy Air Traffic Controller. What reveals a significant level of cynicism on the part of Air New Zealand, however, was the fact that this invaluable piece of information did not come to light until after the publication of the Chief Inspector's final report. As for the short 45-minute simulator exercise, its primary function was to familiarise crews with the polar grid navigation procedures. The fidelity of the simulator would not allow for an accurate reconstruction of the local terrain, and as such, its value in orientating the crew with the local topography of Ross Island was unfortunately not possible. Indeed, the simulator detail was conducted with a nighttime environmental depiction, which was not representative of the flight's actual conditions. Not that this has any direct bearing on the subsequent events. The account given to the Commission by Captains Wilson and Johnson, the Flight Manager Line operation, as to the verbal content of the RCU briefing was not accepted by the majority of the pilots who attended these briefings. Indeed, there was one pilot who said upon listening to the evidence given that he was led to wonder whether in fact they were talking about the same briefing at all. In summary, the Commission established beyond doubt that the route briefing provided to Collins and his crew was inadequate, noting specific omissions and inconsistencies. But most importantly of all, reinforced by the material which he had taken away from the brief, Collins had left with the clear impression in his mind that the planned track south would take the aircraft down the wide open expanse of McMurdo Sound. In relation to the altitudes flown, again Collins would be left with the clear impression that once he remained visual and had received approval from the local air traffic control unit, he was at liberty to descend not only below the 16,000 IFR ceiling, but also the 6,000 VFR one as well.
Mr. Hewitt, you say whilst typing information from the worksheet into the computer You inadvertently typed the longitude at McMurdo as 164 degrees 48 east rather than 166 degrees 48 east.
That is correct.
We are told that in aviation navigation there is a principle of check, cross-check and recheck. On the process that you've described, what was your check as to the accuracy of the information you'd inserted?
The visual check.
What was your cross-check?
I called the flight plan up and had a look at that.
Your recheck?
I did not do a recheck.
Your Honour, could Exhibit 47 NXG of Mr. Chippendale's report be shown to the witness? Now, that map shows that the route goes to the west of Mt.Erebus and not over the top, doesn't it?
But this chart was produced for publicity purposes and not as an operational document. It's artist's license.
Well, then I take it that you'd be surprised if that was given to the aircrew in the course of their pre-flight briefing.
I would be very surprised, sir.
You say the publicity department prepared this?
Yes.
From what material?
The information we gave them.
Annex H. Do you know who prepared that map?
Again, it's the publicity department.
Prepared on the basis of information supplied by the navigation sections.
Yes, sir.
This map also shows an incorrect track down McMurdo Sound.
Yes, sir.
And would you be surprised if that map was shown to flight crews as part of their pre-qualification briefing?
Very surprised, sir.
Because it is, of course, quite misleading as to the official track.
Yes, sir.
Annex I, the strip chart. The tracks there go to the west of Erebus, don't they?
Yes, sir.
And that is the military route down McMurdo Sound, is it not?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Hewitt. No further questions.
Of the maps and charts allegedly given to the crews at their briefings, only one shows the official track over Erebus.
Mr. Davison.
Annex J for Mr. Hewitt, please.
And only one. This jet navigation chart was given by Air New Zealand to Ron Chippendale, the Chief Inspector of Air Accidents. It appears in his report as Annex J.
You've told us this document was prepared prior to the first flights in 1977.
Yes, sir. A copy was available in the briefing envelope that went on the first flight and was returned to the navigation section after each flight.
I would like you to look at this document.
Although Hewitt admits responsibility for the original mistake, neither he nor Air New Zealand Council is prepared for what follows.
Now, it's not the same as Annex J, is it, Mr. Hewitt? I suggest to you that that line, that track on the new map between Cape Hellett and McMurdo Sound indicates that somebody has drawn a track down McMurdo Sound to the position situated at 164 degrees, 48 minutes east. Would it surprise you to learn that this exhibit was attached to the briefing material handed out to every pilot in connection with the 1978 flights?
It would surprise me greatly.
Let's recap. In September of 78, you make an error in selecting a position of 164 degrees 48 minutes. And then from the first briefing after that, an entirely different track and distance diagram with your mistaken coordinates on it appears and forms the basis of the pilot's briefing. Don't you think that's an unusual coincidence?
It is.
So the question arises, Mr. Hewitt, as to whether the 164 degrees 48 minutes was a mistake in the first place. In other words, was it intended to have a flight track as shown on this exhibit? But in any event, taking a rather lesser view of the matter than Mr. Davison's putting to you, does this exhibit show near enough a track running down to the coordinates that you have told us are not correct? Those are the matters to be considered.
You should have given us notice you were going to produce that document.
So you did know about it?
We were going to produce it ourselves.
You didn't give us notice you were going to produce it?
Lawton was going to produce it as part of his evidence.
Why didn't they give that map to Chippendale then? Why they only give him Annex J, showing the track over Mt.Erebus?
And why did your executive mates tell Chippendale Annex J was used in the briefing when it wasn't, and not tell them about this map, which was used?
We don't accept that.
Mr. Hewitt, just looking now at the chain of circumstances which appear to have been the result of the navigation section's involvement in these flights, I suggest to you the first error was when you selected the wrong coordinates when you programmed the computers in September 1978. Do you agree that was an error or an omission?
A minor inaccuracy.
Secondly, you have told us you inadvertently pushed the wrong key. Do you agree that was an error or omission?
That was an error.
Thirdly, when Mr. Brown was given the job of inserting those... Fourthly, if it in fact be established that Mr. Lawton be the man who... If it be proved that Exhibit 16 failure by your section to pick up that the error in the McMurdo position, when you visually checked what you put in, you omitted to pick up the difference between what was in front of you and what was on... Failure to insert the appropriate computer trigger. Captain Johnson was told by Captain Simpson that the difference between the failure of the pre-flight dispatch officer to advise Captain Collins... Then Captain Johnson's report to you of a 2.1 nautical mile change would be an error or omission?
Yes.
That is number 10. Can you think of any other errors or omissions we should add to the list before going any further?
No, I can't.
All these errors. And in a company which in its navigation section tells us we are dealing with people who check and cross-check and recheck and never assume anything. It's a woeful story, isn't it?
It is not a good story.
I suggest to you, for people whose job it is to be precise, it is a woeful story.
That is your opinion, sir.
No further questions, Your Honour.
Thank you, Mr. Hewitt. You may step down.
At the Collins briefing, were the crews shown any chart on which the actual track over Mt.Erebus was drawn?
No.
Did you indicate by pencil or otherwise the actual track?
I did.
And you made it specifically clear that the track took the aircraft in the vicinity of the summit of Mt.Erebus?
I did.
Captain Wilson, were you aware at the time of the briefing that pilots were not obliged to follow that track over Mt.Erebus?
Yes.
But if you knew that, why did you tell them they would be flying over Mt.Erebus?
I was following the prepared script where it says so.
I suggest to you, Captain Wilson, that in the written briefing material, that is the prepared script you say you were following, there is in fact not a single written word to indicate the flight will be taking you over Mt.Erebus.
But that was made clear in my remarks.
Just answer yes or no.
There is no specific written word.
There were in fact two crews at the briefing you conducted, weren't there, Captain Wilson?
Yes.
Collins and his crew are dead, but of those still living, we have Captain Gabriel, First Officer Irvine, and their commander, Captain Simpson. And I think you will recognise them there at the back of the room. Do you see them?
Yes, I see them.
And so, apart from yourself, the other three living persons who are in a position to assist the Commission as to what was discussed verbally at your briefing are Messrs. Gabriel, Simpson and Irvine. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it fair to say, Captain, that you are simply not equipped to brief crews for a low-level scenic flight without having been there before?
That would be correct.
You have told Council that you made earlier requests to go down to the Antarctic. Did you emphasize the points that we've just discussed, that you could hardly brief people on a scenic flight at low level when you hadn't been there yourself? It would be a little like the blind leading the blind, would it not?
Yes.
Would you answer any questions put to you by His Honour?
Thank you, Captain Wilson. You may step down.
Wilson's evidence is greatly at variance with the Air New Zealand executive evidence already given, and Wilson becomes, after Hewitt, the second major casualty of the hearings.
Captain Simpson's recollection of the same route brief received alongside Collins is significantly at odds with the previous comments made by Captain Wilson. He will testify that he was not informed that the track south from Cape Hallett would pass directly over Mt.Erebus, but rather he was left with a clear impression that the track would take his aircraft down the Sound, with the high terrain of Ross Island to pass down his left side. Indeed, with regard to the altitudes which may or may not be flown in the area, he was likewise left with the opinion that so long as he could remain clear of cloud and have his intentions approved by the local air traffic control unit, he was also at liberty to descend below 6,000 feet. Witness after witness, all current DC-10 pilots with Air New Zealand, testify to have similar understanding on completion of their respective briefs. But it is Simpson's discovery of the false destination waypoint at the southern end of McMurdo Sound, and his version of how this discovery was communicated to Air New Zealand, which impacts hard Mahon's growing scepticism of the airline's version of events.
Leslie Simpson and his crew attended the same briefing as Collins.
The briefing officer, Captain Wilson, referred to many matters in the course of his briefing that I do not recall. Captain Wilson said he mentioned to us that the track would come from Cape Hallett over Erebus to McMurdo. I have absolutely no recollection of him saying this. My understanding was that the track proceeded to a position in McMurdo Sound.
Simpson goes on to detail his phone call to Ross Johnson, which set off a chain reaction in Air New Zealand's flight operations, leading to a change in the McMurdo destination waypoint. The contents of that phone call are hotly disputed.
I did not report this matter to Captain Johnson as an error in position, as I had no reason to believe the 164.48 position at the bottom of McMurdo Sound was other than the logical point to terminate the flight plan track. Captain Johnson is not correct when he states that I rang him and told him that the McMurdo position was in error and should be 166 degrees 58 minutes. Captain Johnson's recollection is also incorrect on the matter of my mentioning the cross-track distance. I certainly did mention to him that the cross-track distance to the nearest ground navigational aid was approximately 27 miles to ensure that subsequent crews were not unnecessarily surprised at the distance.
Thank you, Captain Simpson. Would you answer any questions?
Captain Simpson, my instructions enable me to say to you that so far as my client company is concerned, your integrity and veracity are beyond any question. For your part, do you accept a similar position so far as Captains Ross Johnson and John Wilson are concerned?
Yes. Does it matter what he thinks? It's what I think.
You would accept, no doubt, that there are areas where your recollection diverges from that of Captains Johnson and Wilson?
Yes.
Would you also accept that they and you could be at fault in certain areas of personal recollection?
I make no claim to having an impeccable memory. I heard and saw the briefing once. Captain Wilson's evidence in general I have no great conflict with. It's just the extreme fine detail that he appears to have included for the commission that I don't recall. In Captain Johnson's case, however, the description I heard in this court was so different to my recollection of that briefing that I wondered if, in fact, I'd attended the same briefing.
Captains Johnson and Wilson would almost inevitably have had some regard to the notes from which they used to work.
Yes, I would expect so.
Whereas what you carried away was a general impression.
Yes, but I was asked to recall my flight and the briefings at an interview with Mr. Chippendale and Captain Gemmell only 1 month after I made the flight. As well as giving Captain Eden a copy of that interview, I kept one for my own record, so I do have that available for reference.
This interview 1 month after your flight, you say, included, as a member of the group, Mr. Gemmell?
Yes, sir.
Am I to take it then that your explanation as to how you came to report the coordinates position was given at that meeting?
Yes, that's correct.
Therefore, the airline has known from mid-December of last year, about 15 days after the disaster, your exact position on that matter. Yes, sir. As a puzzle for you, Gary, that Air New Zealand have known the nature of Simpson's evidence for so long, yet have maintained implacably their position that the official route was always over Erebus and that the minimum prescribed altitude was 6,000 feet.
The tickets, Your Honour. Washington, Florida, then London.
Thank you. Let Mr. Baragwanath know.
Perhaps Simpson's understanding of the briefing was just peculiar to him.
And I have absolutely no recollection of Captain Wilson advising us at any stage that our flight track would overfly Mt.Erebus. As regards the 6,000 feet height, I considered this to be for the purpose of a cloud break procedure, and that further descent in VMC, visual meteorological conditions, was at the captain's discretion, subject to approval from the local McMurdo air traffic controller.
Simpson and Gabriel's understanding of their briefing is not unique. A succession of line pilots take the stand. They had been briefed for Antarctic flights at different times over a period of 2 years before the crash.
I do not recall Captain Wilson making any clear statement to the effect that we would overfly Mt.Erebus.
And subject to clearance by the local air traffic controller, I considered I was at liberty to descend further so long as VMC conditions could be maintained.
I took from our briefing that the flight track passed to the west of Mt.Erebus and that our approach to the McMurdo area was via the McMurdo Sound. I did not understand from the briefing that we were restricted from descending below 6,000 feet.
But an executive pilot, Captain Maynard Hawkins, flight manager training, testifies to a different understanding of his briefing.
I have a clear recollection that we did not descend below 6,000 feet, which in my mind was clearly the company's minimum permissible altitude. I'm aware that a newspaper article has been produced at this commission, which states that my flight descended to approximately 700 feet above the ice shelf. This is definitely not correct.
Are you saying that such a statement was factually incorrect because the aircraft was never anything like that low?
The statement is totally incorrect.
We've received information from a passenger on your flight, and he understood that the aircraft descended to approximately 1,000 feet. Was that information also quite incorrect?
That would be totally incorrect.
Mr. McAllister.
Captain Vetty attended the same briefing as you attended.
Correct.
And Captain Vetty is a flight instructor, DC-10s.
Correct.
And are you aware that Captain Vetty descended to 1,500 feet whilst over McMurdo?
Yes, I'm now aware of that fact.
So we're left with two alternatives. Either Captain Vetty interpreted the briefing instructions differently from you, or he deliberately disobeyed those instructions. Are you suggesting that Captain Vetty deliberately disobeyed them?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all.
In fact, many senior captains in Air New Zealand have interpreted the instructions differently from you, haven't they?
Yes, it would appear so.
I put it to you that if instructions are ambiguous, then they are deficient, aren't they?
In hindsight, yes.
Good morning. Peter Grundy, the flight operations manager, is Air New Zealand's first executive witness.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Captain Grundy, did you understand that the minimum altitude at which Air New Zealand aircraft were permitted to fly in the Antarctic was 6,000 feet?
I did.
Have you heard from Air New Zealand employees any suggestions that the aircraft may have been flying below 6,000 feet?
I have not.
I'd like you to look at this newspaper article. The 8 o'clock of Saturday, 22nd October, 1977. It refers to a flight on a morning that week. Now, perhaps if I read this and you check that it's correct. Peter Mulgrew is ecstatic and elated by the breathtaking panorama of the world's most alien territory. He points out landmarks he's come to know so well.
Have you seen it?
At the controls, Captain Hawkins brings the DC-10 down to 200 meters over Scott and McMurdo bases, well below the towering volcano Erebus, belching smoke only 40 kilometers away. Did such a report come to your attention at any stage?
It did not.
If it had, would it have caused you concern?
Yes, it would have, as it was a breach of the minimum altitude laid down.
And nobody brought this article to your attention?
They did not. It's the first time I've seen it.
This is a trade magazine called Travelling Times, published in September '78.
Yes.
As we neared the Ross Ice Shelf, Captain Vetty began a gradual descent which would bring us to approximately 3,000 feet above the ice. Now that indicates, does it not, that the aircraft went below 6,000 feet?
It does.
Was that article ever drawn to your attention?
This is the first time I've seen it.
The Central Leader, published on the 28th of November 1978. I quote, "We seem almost to hang over frozen land, and at 2,000 feet, we are low enough to see Hudson vehicles clearly." Was that article ever drawn to your attention?
It was not.
The Western Leader, November 1978. Was that article ever drawn to your attention?
It was not.
Thank you, Captain Grundy.
Mr. Davison.
Keesing was on that flight.
Who's Keesing?
Doug Keesing. He was the director of flight operations in 1978.
Mr. Davison.
Captain Grundy, as at the 7th of November 1978, did Captain Keesing hold the position in Air New Zealand of Flight Operations Director?
He did.
And as such, he was the senior officer within the company having responsibility for flight operations.
He was.
Were you aware that Captain Keesing was on Captain McWilliams' flight, which descended to a level of 2,000 feet?
I was aware quite some time afterwards that he was on that flight.
When exactly?
I cannot recall exactly.
If it were established that Captain Keesing well knew that the aircraft in which he had travelled had descended to a level of 2,000 feet, would you expect him, as Flight Operations Director, to have taken some steps to have ensured such descent did not recur on further flights, if, in fact, 6,000 feet was a minimum flight level?
I would expect him to raise the matter, yes.
To your knowledge, did he ever raise it with you?
Not with me.
With any other person?
Not to my knowledge.
Captain Grundy, do you know why it was that on the fatal flight, and not on other flights, that 6,000 feet was a minimum safe altitude?
I do not, sir.
Captain Ross Johnson conducted the simulator briefings for Collins and Simpson's crew. Johnson is adamant about the minimum altitudes, but when referring to the flight in 1977, which he himself commanded, he makes an extraordinary admission.
Whilst orbiting McMurdo Base, I requested clearance from air traffic control to descend. This was approved, and I descended to 3,000 feet.
Were you aware, in descending to 3,000 feet, that you were disobeying a restriction imposed by your employer?
Yes, I was.
Is it common for Air New Zealand pilots to disobey restrictions imposed by the company?
I would not believe so, but...
Had you done it before?
No, I had not. Not knowingly.
Well, you, when you were giving briefings, would have expected other pilots to obey your restrictions?
Yes, I would.
Why then, on this occasion, did you disobey a restriction?
That is something of which I'm certainly not proud. I don't believe in the context it took place it was unsafe. Of course, that doesn't condone it.
Did you, after your flight, tell any of your fellow pilots that you'd gone below the minimum restricted altitude?
No, I don't believe I did.
I saw a journalist holding up a number written on a piece of paper. 8, I believe. But either of you know what that signifies?
I can't say I saw it.
Gary?
I think they're just sort of, running their own truth is stranger than fiction competition, sir.
It had been made very clear at the briefing.
Johnson also reveals that although he understood the route to be over Erebus and briefed the crews accordingly, he himself had nevertheless flown down McMurdo Sound on his approach.
On your flight south, you departed from the planned track and proceeded to McMurdo down McMurdo Sound.
Yes, that is correct.
And you felt free to do that as long as you had air traffic control authority?
Yes, I did feel free to do that. And I'm sure it was well within the intent of the operation.
With regard to the slides that were being shown at the audio-visual briefing you gave Collins, was it not important that those slides depicted the track that you intended the aircraft to follow?
Yes, it was.
And we now know that certain slides depicted a different track, don't we?
Yes, we do.
If Captain Simpson, Gabriel and First Officer Irvine all considered that the route was down McMurdo Sound, if there was a misunderstanding as to whether Civil Aviation's approval had been given for descent in the McMurdo area, if the route had not been defined on any topographical map, if the briefing officer, Captain Wilson, thought that there could be a descent below 6,000 feet, and if there was not a proper understanding of whiteout, would you agree that not only the briefing of Captain Collins, but the briefings for Antarctic flights in general were inadequate?
I would have to have a measure of agreement with you.
The navigation section was involved, the briefing section was involved, the simulator was involved, and head office was involved in arrangements with Civil Aviation. Whose responsibility was it to coordinate all those people involved in this area?
My responsibility.
What now?
The $64,000 question. We asked Johnson what Simpson said to him about the McMurdo destination coordinates. Simpson says he mentioned to Johnson a 27-mile cross-track difference.
If he did, if he actually mentioned the number of miles, then there's no excuse for Hewitt and Johnson treating the correction as 2.1 miles.
And no excuse for Hewitt not notifying Flight Dispatch, and no excuse for Flight Dispatch not telling your husband that his approach to McMurdo was taking him not over flat sea ice, but straight at a 13,000-foot volcano.
That telephone conversation with Captain Simpson took place after Simpson's flight, did it not?
I would take that as being correct.
Captain Simpson will say he did not mention the actual coordinates to you. Do you recall him mentioning a cross-track error?
Not in specific miles or magnitude.
Do you not recall him telling you he'd been surprised at seeing approximately 27-mile cross-track difference when he was overhead the TACAN navigation aid?
No, I do not.
Do I gather you made a record of what was said?
I noted it down, I believe.
Do you have that?
No. I don't believe I do. It was noted on a pad, and I believe I then processed the 3 points.
Mahon's demeanour as he listens to the deposition from Air New Zealand slips from misgiving to suspicion to downright anger. He is becoming more and more convinced that what he is being forced to listen to is nothing more than an elaborate cover-up.
Oh, thank God it's Friday. Not over yet. Get our New Zealand Council in here.
David.
Yes?
The Commissioner would like to see you in his chambers.
David, it is axiomatic that no final conclusions on matters of credibility can ever be reached until all the evidence is heard. Yes, sir. However, I am bound to say that I have grave doubts about the navigation and briefing evidence. As far as the navigation evidence goes, for all I know, there may be a document produced which completely confirms that very involved series of errors. We shall wait and see. But as for the briefing evidence... Your Honor? The analysis of the flight recorder, I think you will agree, proves that Collins assiduously held that aircraft on its computerized flight track after each descending orbit. And if that is the case? If that is the case, David, then how can it still be said by your briefing officers that Collins and Cassins really believe their computerized flight track led them towards Erebus? Are your briefing officers saying that Collins deliberately flew that aircraft at 1,500 feet straight into a mountain right in front of them? I am disturbed by the air a profound disbelief which seems to pervade these hearings. This is not a criminal trial. It is a public inquiry which is charged with finding the cause of a disaster in which 257 people lost their lives. Its raison d'etre is surely to prevent any reoccurrence of such a tragedy. And that is all.